Flexing its muscles, Iran test fires more missiles as the US slaps further sanctions on Tehran. It's another chapter in the standoff between Iran and the West over its nuclear program. Is this more saber-rattling? And what chance has diplomacy in diffusing the tension? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazm Seeker. It was a show of might that could test the West's patience. Iran said it has successfully test-fired 2 long-range missiles during military exercises in the Gulf. Just a day before that, US President Barack Obama signed a law imposing tougher financial sanctions to penalize Iran for its nuclear research program. Iran's response to that was a threat to halt oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow shipping passage through which 1/6 of the world's oil supply passes, a move the US has made clear it will not tolerate. Well, let's take a closer look at those US sanctions then. On Saturday, Barack Obama signed into law a $662 billion defense bill, part of which included tough sanctions against Iran. Now, the law cuts off from the US financial system foreign firms that do business with Iran's central bank. But Obama made it clear, though, that though he signed the bill, he still had concerns. He said, "The fact that I support this bill as a whole does not mean I agree with everything in it." So, is Iran moving closer to a real confrontation with the West? Well, joining me now to talk more about that from Beirut, we have Mohammad Marandi, Professor of American Studies at Tehran University. He's also a visiting fellow at the American University of Beirut. In Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, Hussein Shobokshi is a columnist with the Saudi-owned Al-Sharq Al-Awsat newspaper. And with us here in Doha is David Roberts, the Deputy Director of the Royal United Services Institute. Good to have you all with us. David Roberts, if I could start with you. What do you read into all of this right now?
Well, to some degree, not an awful lot. This is not the first time we've had some kind of bluster from Iran, and it certainly won't be the last time. Having said that, I suppose we shouldn't ignore these things. I would suspect, I don't know, I would suspect that the prime motivator for the latest rash of bits and pieces that they've been up to is most likely the sanctions, of course. The notion that they're rattling the saber, as it were, perhaps trying to cow some of the European states in particular into not following America's tough lead.
Hussein Shobokshi, what do you believe is the message behind not only these missile tests, but the US sanctions just a day earlier? Because we do see a real ratcheting up here of the stakes. What do you read particularly into the timing of all this?
Well, let's not forget the big chimpanzee in the China room. It's an election year in the United States of America, and Obama has been criticized by his Republican rivals that he's soft on Iran, and I think this goes well as a defensive mechanism, or maybe an offensive mechanism by Barack Obama against Iran to one-up the Republican rivals. But I don't discount what has been happening in the oil market and in the bourses around the world. The stock markets and the oil market have taken this extremely well. They've been very numb and neutral. No serious jump in the oil prices, no serious reaction in the stock markets, at least the ones that are operating today, such as the ones that are in the Middle East, for instance. Analysts have gone on the record saying that this is not a serious attempt to escalation in the Gulf. So I do not make a lot of what has been going on in the last 3 days between Iran and the West, and particularly in the United States. We've seen this happening since the Iranian revolutions, and no conflict. The West has always taken a stronger stance against Iraq, against Syria's nuclear ambitions, and they've allowed Israel to actually hit that. They haven't done the same with Iran.
Let's get Mohammad Marandi's view on this. Mohammad, are these missile tests a reflection of the diplomatic and economic pressure that Iran has come under lately?
Well, the Iranians feel that there's a lot of bluster coming from the United States. After all, you see American politicians calling for assassinating Iranian scientists, assassinating Iranian politicians, assassinating military officials, and of course repeatedly threatening Iran with military attacks. And now you have, of course, the signing into law of a sanction against the Iranian central bank. So the Iranians are basically warning the United States from escalating the situation too far. I think, in my opinion, the Iranians don't believe that the Americans are looking for war, but at the same time, the Americans are being forced into a position, probably by the Israelis and the Israeli lobby in the United States, into a position where we could, in the future, face some sort of military confrontation. Because if the United States actually does go ahead and try to impose an oil embargo on Iran, that would mean that the United States is trying to strangle the country. And when someone tries to strangle someone else, you get a very severe response.
Let's talk a little bit more about Iran's latest diplomatic proposal, which was put forward a couple of days before. On Saturday, Tehran offered a new round of talks on its nuclear program with 6 world powers. The country's top nuclear negotiator, Saeed Jalili, said he has formally called on the United States, Russia, China, Britain, France and Germany to return to negotiations. Now, the last round was held in January, but ended in failure. Now, Mohammad Marandi, if I could turn back to you on this, what's behind Iran's approach here? Because on the one hand, you have this apparent saber rattling with the missile tests and the threats to close the Strait of Hormuz, and on the other, you have this offer of more dialogue. What's going on?
The Iranians obviously want to be seen as the side that is willing to talk and not as the irrational side. The Iranians believe that the Americans are basically behaving in a very irrational manner by constantly threatening the country with bombings and with so-called punitive sanctions. The Russians at the moment, and over the last few months, they put a proposal forward, a step-by-step proposal to resolve the issue, and the Iranians have agreed in principle to support it. The Russians, in fact, told the Iranians, senior Russian officials have told the Iranians that the Americans supported their move. But so far it's become clear to the Iranians that the Americans have misled the Russians, and they're not willing to support this move. And this is, of course, history repeating itself, because in the past, when the Brazilians and the Turks tried to resolve another nuclear issue with regards to Iran's nuclear fuel for its experimental reactor in Tehran, the Americans initially backed the Brazilian attempt, and then when the Brazilians succeeded and we had the Tehran Declaration, the Americans and Obama slapped the Brazilian and Turkish leaders in the face and rejected it. So the Iranians believe that the real problem with the United States is not really the nuclear issue, but at the same time the Iranians are quite willing to find a way to resolve it.
Hussein Shobokshi, what chance does the diplomacy have here, particularly among Arab states like Saudi Arabia? Because we know, of course, from the release of the US diplomatic cables by the whistleblower website WikiLeaks back in 2010, that a number of Arab countries like Saudi Arabia wouldn't think it's such a bad thing if Iran were attacked at this point.
Well, I don't know about the accuracy of that, because on the record, Saudi Arabia, as well as other countries, have expressed their reservations about a straightforward military campaign against Iran, because the beneficiary of that move would be Israel, because they are the ones who have been pushing this issue consistently, because Iran at the moment does not pose a threat to the United States. It might pose a threat technically and theoretically to Israel. But on the other hand, if such a scenario takes place, the entire area of the Gulf countries would be affected immediately, because it's such the proximity is enormously close, and the damage is beyond calculation. But we have to take into consideration that this is a very distant scenario. I don't see a war taking place between Iran and the West, between brackets. I use the word West here, but I see it escalating. There are elements. I think Iraq is going to play a role. So would Turkey, to sort of cool the situation, because if the situation becomes chaotic, Turkey and Iraq would be affected negatively immediately.
David Roberts, I know you said earlier that this is just another series of developments in what's been a long-running saga here. But do you fear that when all of this plays out, there could still be the likelihood of some type of armed confrontation with Iran, either from the United States or from Israel?
Needless to say, it's a possibility. I think the most telling or the most important aspect of all this is this ratcheting of tension. Is as you know, for example, Iran has all its boats and its armed forces in Hormuz or in and around the area at the moment, and it's not, you know, it's not the open ocean. It's 20 miles of navigable river, navigable sea across, of course, and it's the proximity which is quite concerning. So I don't see a deliberate escalation to conflict, for example. But the notion of an accidental collision, an accidental coming together of opposing forces, I think this is the key concern. And this, as I say, will only get worse as these tensions rise and as the Straits, for example, is ever more full.
Mohammad Marandi, let's look at possible scenarios here. If that were to happen, if there were some type of airstrike on Iran, what would the response from Iran be?
I think I agree with your guess that it's highly unlikely, but the response would be very severe. And I think that you will have a complete disruption of any oil coming from the region because it's not just the Strait of Hormuz. You have tankers throughout the region moving. You have oil and gas installations. And Iran's coast goes from the north to the very southern part of the Persian Gulf. And therefore, it'll be a situation where installations will be damaged, oil tankers will be damaged, and Iraq will be affected. Central Asia is unstable. I think public outrage in many parts of the region will create unpredictable situations in countries like Iraq and in the Republic of Azerbaijan. I think it would just be an extraordinary tragedy for the global economy and bring about the most severe of global economic depressions. So if the United States is really thinking rationally, and I certainly hope that it is, we will not face such a situation.
David Roberts, can I ask you this? It's been argued that the Iranians are in no position to carry out any of these perceived threats, and that most policymakers in the West know that. And if that's the case, doesn't it make you wonder whether all of this is simply designed for public consumption back in Iran?
No, that's a very good question. The phrase of all politics is domestic is one that always sort of leaps to mind in this part of the world. I mean, one mustn't forget it's the asymmetric issues which are at the core of this and which are the core concern. Specifically in terms of the question of Hormuz, perhaps Iran could, in inverted commas, shut it down, severely obstruct the strait for a short amount of time. But given, you know, the US Fifth Fleet is just in Bahrain, of course, the concentration of US forces in particular in this region, I wouldn't suppose that this could go on for a long time, and the consequences for Iran would be absolutely immense, I feel. So from the Iranian side, despite the rhetoric, despite the bluster and these tests, for example, I would expect a measure of restraint to some degree. As I say, going back to my last point though, it's the accidental escalation which I think is the key concern.
Mohammad Marandi, if I could put this to you, it's been argued by Western analysts, mostly, it has to be said, that Iran often exaggerates its nuclear advances in order to perhaps try to gain some kind of leverage in its standoff with the West. Any truth to that?
Well, this is the interesting thing about the West. They constantly claim that Iran is backward, that it is not advancing as it says it does, but on the other hand, it is constantly saying that Iran is a growing threat. They want to have it both ways. The fact, though, is that Iran is a highly developed country. Iran has succeeded in bringing down the most advanced stealth drone that the United States has. They brought it down. They didn't shoot it down. They actually brought it down. The Israelis in Lebanon miscalculated in the same way. They thought that they would be able to overrun Lebanon in the 2006 war, and they were soundly defeated. The only difference here is that you have most of the oil and gas that's being exported stemming from this region. So it would, and the Iranians, they have prepared themselves for such a consequence if the Americans do anything foolish. So I think that the Americans like to underestimate Iran, but that is a very dangerous thing to do. The Iranians, of course, have no intention of initiating conflict. But then again, if the United States tries to strangle Iran, or the United States and its allies try to strangle Iran, just like a human being, if someone tries to strangle a human being, you're going to have a very severe response. And therefore, that would, Ron Paul said, for example, that even the sanctions now on the Iranian central bank constitute an act of war. So even many politicians in the United States recognize that American actions are aggressive, they're unjustified, they're hostile, and they could, as your previous guest rightly pointed out, they could lead to confrontation.
Hussein Shobokshi, what's your view on this, this idea that this Iran is basically simply trying to defend itself from what it sees an attack on all sides?
Well, I don't at all accept the notion that Iran is an innocent party to all of this. Iran has been an aggressor, particularly in the Gulf countries' internal politics. We have seen many of these governments objecting, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Iraq, have all seen various degrees of direct, blunt Iranian intervention that was costly in many cases. So playing the innocent card is not really a very wise move. Iran has to do a lot of soul-searching, political soul-searching, and review a lot of its policies that have caused it to sever its ties with its neighbors. Once that happens, the region will be able to breathe lightly and peacefully again. But without that, Iran has been an annoying source of disturbance for many countries in this region.
Mohammad Marandi, you want to respond to that? An annoying source of disturbance?
Well, I think it would be best to go back to history, and that, for example, Saudi Arabia and many of the other countries in the region, they supported Saddam Hussein in his aggression against Iran. They supported him when he used chemical weapons against ordinary Iranians and against the Iraqi people. I am a victim of 2 chemical attacks myself. I'm a survivor. But after the war, the Iranians forgave what these countries had done, and they set to strengthen their ties with these countries. And therefore, I think that a lot of countries in the region owe Iran quite a bit. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians died as a result of that war. And at the end of the day, the Iraqi regime, the same Iraqi regime that was backed by these countries, actually went and invaded Kuwait and threatened Saudi Arabia. So I think that Iran has many grievances, and also there's a problem of extremist ideologies that are being supported and funded, which are constantly calling for the murder and killing of people who think other than themselves. But I think that at the end of the day, the divisions that are being actively pushed in the region, pursued in the region, come mostly from external sources and countries like the United States who wish to sell more weapons to the countries of the region. Otherwise, the Iranians have said repeatedly that their main interest is good ties with Saudi Arabia and all the countries of the region, Iraq, Turkey, and so on.
David Roberts, can I ask you this? I mean, short of an armed confrontation with Iran, the Western nations don't have a whole lot of options here, do they? I mean, if we look at sanctions, for example, and we mentioned President Obama's latest round of sanctions against Iran, if you wanted to widen that out to another round of UN sanctions, for example, you can't get the Russians and the Chinese to agree sanctions that are much tougher than they are right now. So what's left to do?
There isn't a whole lot left to do. You're spot on there, to be honest. I think the key for greater sanctions, so to speak, if that is what the West want or America wants to push, is Russia and China. And this is where we come back to Hormuz. Were Iran to attempt to close Hormuz or block it for an indefinite period of time, as much as they could say, then this would have severe repercussions on their relations with the Chinese and the Russians for obvious reasons. And so that's yet another reason that I'm not wholly convinced by the notion of how Iran would like to use that as a particular tactic. Otherwise, as you say, there just aren't a lot of options on the table. And going back to the points made by the other guest earlier on, I think the truth lies, perhaps as ever, somewhere in between, to be honest. I mean, in terms of direct interference in the Gulf, in recent years, there's been very little, quite frankly, that I can find any evidence of. Early last year, for example, there was an Iranian spy cell which was arrested and convicted in Kuwait. Certainly, that's one example. Iraq, we can find other bits and pieces of examples there. But otherwise, I'm not wholly convinced by this notion of this Iranian behemoth infiltrating the Arab side of the Gulf. On the other side, of course, let's not forget that if you look at a map of Iran and look at north, south, east and west, you'll find an awful lot of American bases. And so if I was Iranian, if I was sitting in Iran and I saw all these antagonistic bases around myself, around my country, then I would have some reaction too. But it's, as ever, it's never as simple as it's American aggression or it's Iranian aggression. It's quite simply a sort of a mix of the two to some degree.
So final thoughts then, Mohammad Marandi, how do you see this playing out over the coming year? Do you expect more of the same sort of saber rattling and war of words between both sides?
Well, my understanding is that, as your previous guest has rightly pointed out, that the Iranians do not want an escalation in tensions. But the United States has effectively surrounded Iran with military bases, and it is constantly threatening Iran with military attacks. It's also, as I pointed out earlier, trying to destroy the Iranian economy through punitive sanctions. So far they failed because of, as we all know, the IMF report shows that Iran's economy is growing, unlike Western economies, ironically. But I think that the Americans may mistakenly push this too far, and then a miscalculation could have devastating consequences. So I think it's for many people to show the Americans that they are miscalculating and making major mistakes and acting irrationally with regards to Iran.
Yeah, let's put that to Hussein Shobokshi then in Jeddah. Is there a danger that Iran could be pushed too far here?
I think the frustration with the current Iranian leadership do not come from Gulf or Arab states only, but they do come from internal Iranian forces as well. There is a crisis within Iran that is affecting its policies with its neighbors. It needs to be sorted out internally first before we can address it externally.
What do you think Arab nations can do in the meantime?
Be prepared for the worst. I think they should be prepared for the worst economically and definitely militarily. Things are going to get messy, but there's not going to be a confrontation at the end of the day.
David Roberts, you agree with that assessment that things will continue to drag on in this manner over the coming year?
I suppose if one looks to the future, one can see how things have progressed thus far. I don't see any particular game changer coming anytime soon. I suppose that Iran will continue with its asymmetric means. Let's not forget Hezbollah, for example. They're by no means an innocent party in any of this. But I cannot see any particular magic bullet, certainly not. I cannot see anything around the corner which could severely alter this. I mean, the domestic situations in Iran and America with the elections at the moment are certainly a part. I suppose that could be what changes. If the Arab Spring reaches Iran, if something happens there, then this could be it. But otherwise, it's difficult to see.
Yeah, let's put that to Mohammad Marandi. Could some sort of change come from within Iran, within the leadership there?
No, I don't think that's true at all. The Islamic Republic is very stable. It is very strong. The vast majority of people support Iran's peaceful nuclear program. And Iran is a very diverse country as it is. Right now, the president has very strong political opponents. You have a very healthy parliament, which is very critical of the administration. It is much more democratic than almost any country in the region, contrary to the sort of negative media that Iran gets in the United States. So as long as if the United States keeps counting on Iran falling apart, or thinking that if they attack, Iran will fall apart, or that Iran is too weak to defend itself in case of an attack, these are themselves major miscalculations.
All right, well, no one really knows how all of this will play out, of course, over the coming months. But what is for sure is that Al Jazeera will be covering all of it right here. And I want to thank all three of our guests, Mohammad Marandi, Hussein Shobokshi, and David Roberts. Many thanks for your time. And that's it for this edition of Inside Story. Remember, if you want to send us your feedback, insidestory@aljazeera.net is the email address. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. I'm Hazem Seeker. Thanks for watching. The latest news is up next. Bye for now.